At age 12, I had this very interesting moment when I would set up my Barbie doll house. I set up the house, I set up the doll. I was used to playing with this doll and this kind of setting so much that it had become a really important routine for me at this point. But this time I just couldn't feel the same thing anymore. It was like all of the joy, all of the magic had just vanished. And to my personal disappointment, I realized that something must have happened that I had never wanted to happen in the first place. I was starting to grow up. I was an undiagnosed autistic girl, and the inevitable change of becoming adult was very inconvenient to me. I had learned in the environment I was in that growing up essentially meant putting away all of your childlike interests and becoming this totally different person. I even feel like this is a very big misunderstanding that we have in our society, that growing up means leaving your childhood entirely behind. So this is why I need my childlike interest to survive. The problem at the time was that I didn't feel like I didn't like my interests anymore. I still like my dolls. I still like my fairies. I just couldn't put myself into it or indulge in it the way that I used to. And I felt super lost because the only examples of adulthood that I had in my environment were doing their adult things in their adult life with their adult interests. It felt like I was forced to say goodbye to something I never planned to say goodbye to. For all I knew, I could have stayed a child. I would have been perfectly fine being a child forever, playing with my stuff. And yeah, I never used dolls again the way a child would, but I never stopped loving them. So at some point I started to gain this interest in collecting little fairy figurines. You have a beautiful, pretty fairy with the long hair and a unicorn, and I would start to obsessively collect these kind of fairies. There was a point when I had like a shelf just full of these fairy figurines. The funny thing is I figured out later that collecting stuff is also a very autistic thing to do. So basically my special interests, they didn't fade away, they just were transferred to the next accessible thing that was socially acceptable for me to do at my age. And it wasn't, oh wow, oh my god. Oh, I wish you could have just seen that. We have these kind of really big, I will have to put the name here, they're called Milane in German. And they're flying here in the sky all the time, and one just passed very closely by. I could see everything, like see his feathers, his claws, everything. It was just amazing. I wish I could have filmed that. Oh my god, so sad. Okay, anyways. And I remember the time of being a teenager was really messy because finding my identity was so much more complicated. If I couldn't put myself into the boxes other teenagers were creating themselves for, if I felt like I don't care about these things or not as intensely as other teenagers do, but I do care about fairy tales, about stories, about fairies, about puppets, drawing, I love creating characters. So what am I? And I remember in the time where I didn't fully know how to implement them to fit my adult personality in the making. I was very depressed, very unhappy with myself. Sometimes it felt like I didn't even really exist, because even though I was kind of trying to live out my special interests through these age-acceptable alternatives, I couldn't be this anymore because it was expected for me to be a more adult version of myself. But these acceptable ways to engage in my special interests simply weren't enough. It was like suppressing my whole identity with all its colors into a few boxes. But these boxes were tiny, and it was barely a compensation for not being able to be the person I wanted to be. But the point was, that I really didn't realize who or what exactly I wanted to be, as there was no equivalent in my immediate surroundings. As I described in my last video, the moon told me a secret. Instead of finding myself, I found little pieces of me in fictional characters or magical stories. As I said before, just tiny boxes. And it wasn't until I got older, it was the time when I was going to a lot of medieval fantasy festivities in my area and basically finding like-minded people that were openly embracing the fantasy, the imaginative, the spiritual. And this was the time when I started to understand that not only could I still like the things I like, but in fact that I was able to transfer these interests into adulthood. Just learn to become who I truly was, even if it wasn't what society was expecting of a young person at the time, even though it was completely alternative and out of the box. And also to find how much value there is in these things and how important they are. But it took a few more years until I finally got to know my partner and his people, that I could actually become a creator of these things myself, because they didn't just throw away their childlike personality. No, they evolved it into their grown-up self, and what mattered to them as a child didn't have to vanish because it was childlike. Create art from it, create a profession from it. So this was the time when I started to realize that not only did getting back into my childlike interests matter, in fact, it was a life savior in many cases. When I look at my art, if you look very closely, you see the same pattern that I had as a child, because there's always a character in the forefront and there are things happening around her, but it's always the same. There's always a doll in the forefront or a person in the forefront. So my special interest of playing with a doll has transformed into adulthood. I could have never imagined that what I actually cared about was actually an indicator of who I am as a person, what I need as a person. I had never thought that what I cared about as a young child could transform into me becoming an artist and creating art and reaching so many people with it. I can tell you that in the time when I wasn't so sure how to express myself, when I felt like what I actually cared about, all of that was just childish and maybe a bit stupid, because nobody else had these intense interests the way I did. At least I didn't know anyone who had these kind of intense obsessions and interests in these things that I did. Without it, I felt so lost. I felt uncomfortable in my own skin. And it was only after finding these traits again, embracing them, and then later becoming a creator of them, that I started to feel well again about my personality. And the more I started to implement these things in my life and accept that this is just who I am, the more confident, the more self-assured, and the more content I became with myself and my own life. And having these interests and making it my whole life and just being upfront about it and just being who I am helps me to battle so many things that otherwise would just crash me down. I believe that what makes us, even if it may be deemed as a bit silly or a bit weird by society, what makes us the person we are is ultimately what supports us through the worst times, what can give us strength. By indulging in these childlike interests, I can not only feel a lot better, I can take all of the whimsy, all of the beauty, all of the magic that I'm missing in the real world and create a space with myself, with other people, that not only enriches myself and others, hopefully, but also helps me survive in this world. Anything that helps us in this difficult world to survive and to become who we are, no matter what other things, is worth the while. So why not try it? So this is why I need my childlike interest to survive, and maybe why you too need your childlike interest to survive, and why there's nothing wrong with it. How sometimes we can be so much more happy about ourselves when we just pursue those interests instead of pushing it away out of an idea of who we should be.